this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on individualist anarchism. Prior to the in-depth philosophizing I'm about to conduct, it's meaningful to clarify that the anarchism you hear socialists and or communists discuss is not ever anarchism, nor is anarchism truly possible within any sort of state, as to mean that, be it one thinks that some sort of anarchist state may exist, is wrong, as anarchism is intrinsic to the free agent and is a navigation of one's values and or liberdade pensando, thinking what's morally true and or valid and or as a must be good enough and necessary conditions. Psychological truth holds internal and or external validity to be meaningful. Valid and or psychological truth claims allowance for the inferences into what actual factual existing is meaningful and or ultimately true, not merely perceived to be true and or valid and or thought of to be true and or valid, yet is actually factually meaningfully really true and or valid, allowancing for one to conduct one's own liberated thinking and or engage mobile conducts within the internal and or external world. As a individualist anarchist whom is appropriately able to judge for oneself what's meaningful, not by coercion of another whom dogmatically claims X exists without the appropriate evidence to point to certain existing processes and or existing properties meaningful to communicate what's meaningful and or holds a distinct existentia to provide evidence and or the rationale proportionate to what you should believe and or what you should think in relation to one's claims, not from the lack of evidence and or lack of fairness to hold more meaningful just world beliefs, to mean that one should treat the evidence fairly and or just, to be able to think more fairly and just, to mean that even in the treatment of others, one should not expect another to treat one fairly if one treats another unfairly, nor should one expect to experience positive, meaningful emotions and or meaningful experiences within being treated unfairly and or treating another fairly, to more likely in the future experience resentment and or negative meaningful emotions without the solutions to resolve one's self-inflicted, pathetic, petty woes, instead of resolving those issues to conduct what is more meaningfully honester and or fairer, not inappropriate within the misconducts attempting to treat one more meaningfully than one deserves to be treated. Instead, to treat another equitably with a clear, conscious evaluation, judging the risks and or benefits appropriately. This means that the communal and or any collectivistic anarchism is a false anarchism, be it that its origin is not within the self, and it's the self whom is individualistic, who willful liberates one's own self, allowances for the morality and or ethics one exemplifies from the undertaking of the necessary conditions for voluntary suffering and or responsabilidade, never the desnecessário condições more likely to result in slave ethics associated with the conducts, not necessarily the thinking, because one lacks thinking. And it's not so much a morality either. It's the mindless conducting of one's affairs for another's more meaningful affairs and or perhaps meaningless affairs, which is more meaningless and not meaningful, and is the causations of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism, well defined within clear communications as the total control of another's mind-body connections and or desire to control the self within the subjectivity of another's being in order for one to hold some consistency within one's vagueness of thinking, to engage mobile conducts with the ideology one will experience, and never the hope, as one is not doing the meaningful work to conduct the self appropriately, to, in actuality, factuality, probabilistically infer what's appropriate, to think clearly and or engage practical wisdom to derive meaningful benefits from one's evaluation, judging the risks and or benefits in relation to certain conducts, instead of demanding certain conducts from ideologies improbabilistic and in most cases impossible to result in the desired outcomes, leading to the atrocities of often genocide of individuals, as each individual treated as an automaton whom is less than that, lacks a conscience, and is more treated as a disposable robot, not some thinker and or free agent who holds a unique self to engage the subjectivity that may not possibly ever truly engage the exact same meaningful utterances of thought as another, to always hold some distinct, directly and or indirectly associative analytic meaning interpretation to one's being with a distinct perspective, liberating one's mind as one cultivates what one thinks, uniquely clarifying the vaguenesses with certain excuses and or justifications, be it that the excuse excuses one's subjectivity for holding a distinct perspective, yet is rational and or provides certain evidence one may not deny, meaning the evidence is objective and or functional and or meaningful to support the truth claims existing to be truth claims and not false claims and not falsehoods, meaning the claims are supported with the steel manning of certain steel-pressed truth statements composed of propositions, composed of sub-propositions, needing to be valid and or psychologically true to be meaningful, related to certain inferences in the functionalist characteristics within certain inferences into analytic terms. One engages meaningful utterances of thought as one whom is thinking about even one analytic term, defines the analytic term in relation to the multifunctionalities and the conducts one may conduct in relation to X, and or infers the functions within the analytic terms to extrapolate multifunctionalities to define what one means in relation to certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties. Never truly meaningless details to provide, even within the details, some sort of inference into the functionalities within it. And or perhaps, be it one is engaging more detailed communication, multifunctionalities, to think more creatively and solve problems. Yet a vast range of free agents tend to lack the complexity of thinking to infer the multifunctionalities, often needing to start with more rudimentary component parts in our processes to allowance for the processing of complexities. Often intellectuals on their high horse tend to think with wrongful convictions another should know better, yet is wrong as one is more engaging in the tomfoolery to think an individual whom does not hold the meaningful similarities within the existing properties to infer the same existing priors as one holds, be it one is thinking within one's own subjective knowledge, never some inference into what another holds within one's own unique vocabs, perhaps limited for a rationale one may provide more coherently with cogency, even with a scarce, compared to the intellectual amount of vocabulations to communicate, even with, to the best of one's ability, uniquely a few workable working component parts and or processes of one's vocabs to string together creatively meaningful communications, to provide the truth claims, to claim one lacks the same existing priors, and or had one held the subjective knowledge and or subjective self-awareness existing prior to the communications, one would communicate better, meaningfully, with more multifunctionalities, yet one may not hold the same abilities to communicate the multifunctionalities because one may not hold more than 7 theories of knowledge compared to the 2,736 theories of knowledge one may hold with distinct analytic terms from different original instantiators, each with a distinct etymological origin derived from a distinct theory of knowledge. One often forgets the complexities of the vocabs one holds behind one's skull, within the mind-body connections processing it, within the conductions of one's nervous system. Often failing to appreciate the complexities even of communicating with other intellectuals, often attempting to communicate with intellectuals who hold a more complex and or vaster ranging vocabulary to draw from certain unique, distinct vocabs. One may hold a scarcity of knowledge, even oneself, within, to approach those individuals and be more like the individual one is often waving the finger at. A hypocrite for conducting one's affairs in such a grotesque and or unjust treatment of an individual whom may truly be trying to engage in earnest exploration and or attempt to liberate one's own mind in relation to engaging more liberated conducts within one's self, to engage more liberdade pensando, and or perhaps the individual knows other languages and is more able to elaborate on certain communications from those distinct languages, compared to the individual whom is only truly able to communicate one language and yet lacks the distinct, subtle differences even within the same analytic terms that in another language may hold completely distinct meanings and or hold distinct direct and or indirect analytical meaning interpretations more appropriate to distinct communications and or combinations within certain phraseologies unique to the incipient communicators within the history and or etymological origins of those vocabs, often more holding a distinct existence with the cultivation of one's livagencia to expand from the meaningful work of extraordinary intellectual thinkers who had the intelligence to engage the valued, meaningful communications, to write and or record the well-defined within meaningful communications, defining each certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties meaningful to elaborate and or provide easier access to knowledge and or evaluation to the individuals who hold some existing priors to scaffold one's learning and or to build on one's existing priors to allowance for meaningful communication. Truly not necessarily engaging in empathic writing, yet compassionate writing to alleviate the suffering resulting from the resultants of frustration, having experienced the communications one may not comprehend yet needs to hold some self-knowledge and or self-awareness to conduct one's own liberated conducts and or even satisfy certain essential psychological needs and or communicate sensitivities to certain, say, environmental stimuli, to mean that there are certain causations within one's internal and or external surroundings that may be causational of certain psychological disturbances, preventing one from the appropriate rest and or sleep, and or therefore ability to engage in meaningful work, and or perhaps communicate on certain sensitivities to tastes in the water that may indicate toxins and or poisons one is concerned with, to provide meaningful information to the individuals who are more likely to, within the actualities, factualities, probabilistically conduct themselves to resolve the underlying issues appropriately. This is what is truly most valuable about the valuability within engaging in individualist anarchism, thinking more to think for oneself and to provide easier access to knowledge and or evaluations, to liberate other mind-body connections who hold the meaningful similarities, to make sense of for themselves what one may be allowance to engage more creativities, intrinsic creativities, mobile conducts that have progressed human rights and or freedoms from the recognition of the intrinsic value and meaningfulness within human liberties and or most meaningfully individual autonomy, including the meaningfulness within privacy, to be allowance to even cultivate the self-knowledge and or self-awareness within the first tempos uma reflects, thinking about what it is exactly unique to the self that the self needs to define what individual autonomy is, only truly unique to the experiences within privacy. Once one is alone and or has the solitude to think for oneself, to arrive at the meaningfulness within privacy of one's individual autonomy, to not be with others and or to recognize that it's okay to not be with others, and in certain cases one is most relieved to not be with others, and or this often means one is satisfying the need for individual autonomy within one's privacy, as it's often the individuals who coerce and or expect one to engage in certain conducts one does not want to engage in or feel the need to engage in, and or be it one engages is engaging in self-harm, engaging in those expected conducts, be it not misconducts for not defying the other, liberating one's own self, and or engaging the rational thinking appropriate to the proportional judgment to conduct one's affairs appropriately. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep looking at this episode.